When the tide turns in the tropics, look out. Near Broome in Western Australia's far north, the tides are some of the largest in the world, up to 10 metres high. That water beyond the horizon can be well over your head in a matter of hours. Before nightfall, the tide will completely flood this mudflat and the water will be back up here around my knees. As the water rises, the mud gets really sticky. This was a big trap for two newspaper men working up here in the tropics. In fact, it almost cost them their lives. We'll see what we can learn from their experience.
We were going out to Kana Bay, where in the Second World War a Japanese Zero shot down a Dutch East Indies transport plane full of diamonds, essentially. It's quite common knowledge amongst all the Aboriginal people there that I mean, diamonds had become the currency for all their card games, so it was an interesting, quirky story.
Brad Collis lives in the city, where he's a journalist for the Melbourne Age. But it was on assignment in the Outback in June 1982 that he became his own headline, in a scoop that changed his life. On the road with Brad were Aboriginal guide Richard Hunter, who has since died of cancer, and West Australian photographer Ian Cugley.
The main reason for being in the area was to hunt for this lost treasure. It was really something to go up there and into that part of the world. It's a very interesting part of the world.
For a young Ian Cugley, the far north of Western Australia was Adventureland, but he had no idea how close this mission would come to being his last.
Our particular trouble was unforeseen. We were driving along what was hard sand along a beach, and very quickly, and without any warning, the hard sand became very soft sand. And in effect what happened was we became bogged.
We had a 30-foot tide coming in at a great rate of knots, and if we didn't get them, we were bogged. And the prospect of having to tell our employers that their vehicle was 30 feet underwater somewhere off the north of the WA coastline wasn't a great prospect.
We were in a situation where we had to get this four-wheel drive off the beach, out of harm's way, away from the water very quickly. And of course we were digging madly to try and get this four-wheel drive out.
In getting the vehicle out of the bog, we broke fan belt, and we had a spare fan belt, but we had actually given it away to someone previously and just hadn't got around to replacing it, which is a mistake.
With a good head for news, even when he was making it, Ian Cugley recorded the drama with these photographs. The next decision the group made boiled down to one of life and death. With the fan belt broken, being repeatedly bogged wasn't their only problem.
Our other major concern, by the way, was cooking the motor, overheating the motor and blowing the motor. And so as a consequence of that, we were filling the motor with water, our water that we had.
And we had to make a decision on the beach to use the water for the car or leave the car, basically.
And also remembering, of course, that the water was getting higher and higher lapping against the tyres of the car, and we made a decision.
So we used the water, about 20 litres went through, drinking water, for the car.
Reassured by their guide Richard Hunter that they could find drinking water close by, the two had put every drop they had in the radiator. That was enough to get the vehicle up high and out of harm's way, but without a fan belt, it could go no further. Their troubles were just beginning.
When you realise that you're stuck, and you also realise it suddenly hits that you're on your own and no one's coming for you. And for about 20 minutes, half an hour, there's an awful knot in your stomach as you sort of absorb that information.
That night we went looking for some water. He said that there was definitely water in the area.
The water holes that we went to had dried up.
For the first time in my life, I discovered what it was like to be thirsty and not being able to quench your thirst.
It would have been physically hard work getting the vehicle out of the bog. We're very thirsty, and until you've been in that situation, you don't really realise just how thirsty is when there isn't any water.
The men faced a 3 or 4 day walk to help. But in the tropics, that'd be impossible without water. And how much could these two now rely on their Aboriginal guide?
We hadn't found water. He was quite reassuring earlier that we would be able to find water. What does that mean for the next day? Does it mean that he would be able to find water for us or not?
When we come back, we'll retrace the footsteps of these unlucky reporters, see how they found water, and show you how one easy survival tip could have prevented this whole ordeal. John Cooper is the ranger for the Beagle Bay Aboriginal community north of Broome. He and I retraced the footsteps of the stranded newspapermen, but we had the benefit of local knowledge.
The next morning, we also made a decision to take a shortcut across the Cone Bay at low tide. We had to get across that before the tide came in, and that was hard work. That was knee-deep mud every step, and that was pretty exhausting.
If you were ever confronted with a mangrove swamp, walk around. Otherwise, it's bloody hard work. And if you're short on water, that's a waste of energy and fluid. When Brad, Ian and Richard got out of the mud, the ground was indeed hard and flat. It was then they realised they were in the middle of nowhere.
We couldn't afford to stay there. We had to walk out, and that was the thing. It was just a hard slog.
The best way to find water in the bush is to look for nature's signs. John Cooper is an expert.
Well, there's actual tracks here. These tracks here, like we've seen here, this is the main pad that goes on. It's like a highway for a car. The cattle use this, instinctively for their own use. It's a highway for the water.
Once you hit animal tracks, there are two ways of picking which way to turn.
If I'm looking for water and I'm following a cattle pad, you can see the animal tracks like you can see here. The points of the hoof is pretty close together, and if they're walking towards water, because they're not carrying any water, it's just a normal weight of a cattle. The point of the hoof are pretty close together. But I can tell if the cattle's been drinking somewhere, because if they follow that same pad back, those hoofs won't be together, close together, it'll spread out a bit. And that means that the beast had a belly full of water, and that's how I know, that's how I can tell.
If you're not too sure about that, then the easy way is to follow the arrows. It's a classic sign, isn't it, John? There's two paths joining here, and they make a kind of an arrowhead. And the arrow points right on down the track, and that track should lead us to water over there in the mangroves.
Water further ahead.
Let's go and have a look. This is close to the path that Richard Hunter would have followed when trying to find water. He would have seen animal tracks, and look where they come out. a lush green oasis. Here's a little spring. The water looks pretty bad. You'd probably have to boil this first because the cattle seem to have been in it. But do you think you could drink it?
Oh yes, it's drinkable. All you have to do is just get rid of that stuff there, the green stuff up top there, and let it settle for about 15 minutes. And it's there for your taking.
So how can you tell this water's good to drink?
Well, you can always tell. Like this here, it's called spring water now. And the simple reason why I can tell it's good to drink because it's got plants on it. Whereas outside, you've got brackish water. The way you've got brackish water, it kills your plants. But spring water never kills plants, and that's the reason why you can drink this water. And I can tell it's good for human consumption.
It may not look much, but to three thirsty men, this was sweeter than wine, and it enabled them to get to something better.
Well, I guess from there it was probably an hour or so later that we came across the water mill, and there was where we actually filled up.
Still a long way from civilization, the three hiked on. They spent another night on the ground, then another exhausting day on the road till they could go no further.
Richard had cut feet. So on the third day, I think it was, he stopped, and Ian stopped. We had expected to have reached the road by then, and it was puzzling that we hadn't reached the road we were looking for. So on the final morning, I set off with a billy can of water, and I went 500 yards, and saw headlights coming through the dawn, and it was a geologist making his once every 6 months trip to some geoseismic station, and picked us up.
You know, this whole thirsty scenario would have been a lot easier if the three had known one thing. When their car engine was overheating, they needed water, and they were surrounded by it. Seawater. You can use seawater in an emergency in your radiator. Just make sure you flush it out well when you get home. In fact, the higher boiling point of seawater would have made it more effective than the drinking water they were using.
I mean, when you're in that situation, you're not thinking in terms of we are in a survival situation. A survival situation develops, if you like.
The three-day trek north of Broome was front-page news, but for Brad Collis and Ian Cugley, the real story was about Mother Nature, how to appreciate and respect her.
I've been back to the area many times and other places, and trying to learn more and more as I go. And it becomes a question not of survival, but of simply learning to live with the land.
It's worth noting that you don't have to be by the ocean to get wiped out by water. This dust bowl is the Durack River in the dry season. But in the wet season, when the monsoons hit, it very quickly becomes a different picture.
We have a number of those people who, particularly at this time of the year, they're looking for somewhere cooler to camp. They camp in creek beds. You get storms and flash floods.
Ian Cinnamon owns several cattle stations and runs Australian Kimberley tours in the top end. He's seen some campers get washed out of creeks from rain that fell 40 or 50 kilometres upstream.
Oh, look, it could come up in 5 to 10 minutes. I mean, if you get a very heavy downpour upstream and you've got a wall of water coming down, you can just be washed away.
Coming in the door. It's coming in the door. We're going to sink. Oh, my shoes get full.
After the break, we'll go back more than 100 years and use some modern science to see what really killed Burke and Wills.
Sorry to be letting you down, Mr. Burke.
And I immediately thought, well, that's the explanation for Burke and Wills.